The most important part of any structure, such as a house, isn't the siding. It's the foundation, the framing. For this project, we'll be using a cross-laminated European birch core. And that is just a fancy way to say plywood. And we're using plywood here because it will allow us to do some things with this box that would otherwise be impossible using solid wood. And with the foundation complete, let me tell you a little bit more about this project. Hey everybody, welcome to the SawStop channel with the Sawyer Design takeover. My name's Nick Sawyer, and today I'm going to build you a box. And now that you know that I do in fact have a face, back to the FM radio DJ. I'd like to get an idea of the pattern and layout for this classy little coffer and transfer those layout angles to a smattering of templates we'll use to excise the patterns from the pile of veneers. I'm using the miter gauge to cut angle templates from MDF. By using a layout pen, I can keep the patterns coded and separated from the other boxes that, if you're interested, you can see built on my channel, Sawyer Design, here on YouTube, where I'll be focusing a little more on the hand tool approach to this build. Whereas this build here on SawStop's channel, I will be utilizing the SawStop 5 horsepower ICS table saw and their router table as well to demonstrate a few of many ways to approach this little box. To begin breaking down the veneer, I'd advise sandwiching the veneer between supporting sheets of something thicker above and below the veneer to achieve the cleanest cut straight off the saw. I like using a sled. Once the veneer is broken down, a mere hot tip can be used to get an idea of how cutting and pairing the veneer will look once laid out and book matched side by side. Before transferring the layout patterns to the veneer from the templates, it's a good idea to break down your templates to length as to avoid wasting the veneer. To do so, I simply lay out the patterns on the substrate and break them down on the sled. Speaking of sleds, a complement to this video also here on SawStop channel will be linked at the end of the video on how to build the various jigs, sleds, and fixtures that I found most helpful for this build. Now, I'm sure cutting veneers down on the table saw is a totally viable approach to this, but the veneers are commercial 1/42 of an inch and thus very delicate, and I'm more comfortable using a veneer saw to cleanly cut down these bundles of sequence veneers. You might like to know that these sequence bundles are also known as flitches, and these in particular came from certainly wood. Now, the aim here is to lay out two halves of the pie, each of which combine to just a hair over 180 degrees. We shoot for going over center because the fit and finesse of each segment can and will result in some variance from template to finished layup. As you'll see, by aiming for just over half, the final fit to complete the 360 degree pattern is much easier if the halves are 181 degrees. Then the alternative, say each half is 179.75 degrees, well, making up a half a degree of veneer that matches in a sequence pattern is just a real pain, and you're going to have to take my word for that. The fitment and finessing of the individual pieces, as well as the halves, is done with a shooting plane and sandpaper adhered to a block. I prefer sandpaper for the halves, as straightening the edge requires a climb cut with a hand plane, and it's more likely to booger an edge with tear out. Once trimmed down to match the size of the substrate, we can go ahead and veneer the panel. For this, I'll be using a vacuum press because I have one. Using urea formaldehyde glue, I first rough up the gluing surfaces and hinge the veneer along one edge for alignment. A catalyzed adhesive is advisable for pattern veneer applications as it will leave a rigid glue line. PVAs, such as Titebond, have a tendency to creep over time, according to veneer legend Craig Thibodeau. To flush the veneer pattern with the panel, one could certainly use a router bit that pushes or pulls the veneer in the direction of the substrate, but I have found with the dried glue on the edges and L-fence on the table saw is a great way to cleanly achieve this matching of finished edges. Using a less flashy pattern, the process is repeated for the back side of the panel in what will become the interior of the box. I still wanted to hit the corners, but instead of all of the segments of this pie, I'm going to aim for something more reasonable like 4 segments using this thicker 16th inch veneer. With this thicker shop sawn veneer, we can again use the L fence, using a template as guide to run along the fence to cut down this veneer. Don't forget to hang out towards the end of the video where I will link to the video that details the building of a elf fence of your very own. Once out of the veneer press, a heat gun at a 45-degree angle attack on the tape will better your chance of not tearing out the delicate grain as you remove the tape to reveal the pattern. With the inside and outside of the box veneered, the sides can now be separated from the top. In case you hadn't already gathered as much, the point of this pattern layup on the flat 2-dimension was to preserve the continuity of the pattern from the top down the sides. With this 2-in-1 sled, the crosscuts and the mitered corners can be both cut with a double check for parallel edges with a light ripping pass between the steps. After mitering the sides, we'll go ahead and cut a rabbet in the top and bottoms of the sides for the top and bottoms of the box to set into. Making test cuts on a test blank is a good way to ensure that you don't have to redo work. Using masking tape hinges, we can see now that the sides of the box all come together to make a box. And off camera, I repeated all the processes for the bottom of the box as well. The interior uses a similar pattern, and then the bottom was just some Macassar ebony, which in retrospect looks a little goofy, but it's the bottom of the box. Before assembling the box, this will be the last time we have full access, easy access anyways, to the interior surfaces of the box. So I'll take this opportunity to sand down the surfaces to a finish ready 320 grit. Given the intersecting grain directions, a sanding block is used in conjunction with a scraper to achieve flatness and a random orbital sander to smooth out the panel surface. Using the shaper origin, I'll also take this time to inlay my maker's mark from Alec, the medallion maker, shout out, into the bottom of the lid. If you're sitting there wondering how we get pattern continuity with an 1/8 inch kerf from the saw, at least from the top to the sides, well, I was inspired by Adrian Ferrazzuti for this project in general, and much like his boxes, a trim piece will accent the edges all the way around the box after assembly. With the box assembled, I ripped down all of the trim pieces on the bandsaw and using a guide with a saw kerf thickness and depth, cut into the face of a random piece of plywood and a fence screwed into the side to reference the plane against, I can use the hand plane to bring down the trim to a smooth and uniform thickness that will be just thicker than the rabbet in the edge of the box. A similar jig with a 45-degree cut at the end of it and a trough for the milled trim is used to first establish a 45-degree corner with a sharp chisel. With that reference, the other end of the trim can be marked and cut, ensuring tight corners and miters, as this procedure is followed around the perimeter of the lid. Now I wasn't entirely sure how I would lay up the box pattern when I set out to make this. But given the rectangular shape of the box, the corners of the pattern didn't quite meet at the edge of the box as I would have liked them to, so I opted to cut the rabbet out of the corners down the sides and add trim around those edges as well, with a three-way miter at the intersection of the top and bottom of the box. Orientation was a little bit tricky to keep track of, so using a white chalk pencil, I marked just the general direction of the miter, just to make sure I was making all the cuts in the right direction. In the dado of my jig, a 45-degree handsaw curve made the coarse lengthening of this trim easy, so the fine-tuning with a chisel could be done in the manner of just a single light pass. Though this made the project quite a bit more laborious, if I don't say so myself, the addition of those three-way miters turned out pretty damn sexy. Well worth the effort. With the trim fit and glued in place, I can come back and flush trim to the surfaces of the box. Now this can be done with a hand plane, but the more efficient way to go about this, and probably the safer so that you don't cut into the thin veneer on the surfaces of the box faces, is to go ahead and step over to the SawStop and using a compression bit, flush trim the trim down to the sides. I found that with this light of a pass, a climb cut against the rotation of the router felt safe, unlike a heavier cut, which I would definitely not recommend using a climb cut ever, but the climb cut in this light of a pass really minimized the chance of tear out in those delicate edges. The router really makes easy work of that operation. And now, finally, we can crack this wooden geode open to reveal the interior of the box. Once two edges are cut, I like to come back with some 1/8 inch kerf filling supports to ensure the cuts on the other two sides don't cause the lid to pinch the blade and mess up the division of the box lid to the box body. The embedding of the walnut strip into the substrate was originally intended to be the mating surface of the lid of the box, but again, this pattern that I ended up at caused some discontinuity in the pattern, so I opted to trim the interior edges with a mitered lip. This trim is over thickness because I will come back and thickness down to the 3/64 or whatever it needs to be after glue up, as milling that thin of stock is more likely to destroy the material than cleanly surface and thickness the stock. It's an easy enough operation to come back and slice that lip down to thickness after it's already glued to the edge of the lid in the box. With the interior mating surfaces addressed, we're in the home stretch, and it's time to get some hardware installed. For hardware, I opted to use Sauce invisible hinges, and these are really cool new little Baruso brass latches, all of which will be linked in the description below. And I cheated just a little bit by using the Shaper Origin to take care of all the inlay for me, but this could just as easily be installed by transferring the hardware to the surface and removing the bulk of the waste with a router or drill and paring the edges down to fit the hardware with your favorite sharp chisel. The Sauce hinges are a little more tricky But they do come with templates and drilling depth guides in the packaging and really great instructions if you happen to not own a $2,500 automated router. I wanted to make sure the two halves of the box touched each other in all the right places, and to make sure the mating surfaces were flat, I opted for a hand plane and sanding block, but this could also be done with a flat reference surface like your saw table, and using sandpaper taped to the surface, grinding the mating surfaces of the box down to a uniform flatness. This step is probably better done before the hardware, as I did end up having to come back and tweaking the hinge mortise steps just a little bit. When installing the hinges, I found it to be a good trick to clamp everything in line and properly gapping the top to the bottom so that when you are screwing the hinges into place, the installation doesn't have a chance to pull anything out of alignment. And this is looking really great, but I've been hiding something from you. And I'm going to let awkward in front of a camera Nick tell you more about that. All right, well, as usual, I have goofed just a little bit. As I've probably already mentioned, this stuff is super thin, stupid thin, 1/42 of an inch. The seams have a tendency to what's called bleed, and that's where whatever the adhesive glue is, it'll be sucked up in the vacuum bag through the seam, and it can leave dark glue lines. I think I've gotten away with this in the past because I have used clear epoxy, but using the urea formaldehyde, it dries really dark brown. And I have one gap that is just driving me nuts, and I'm going to try to fix it. I think I could probably just gouge it out with a knife, fill it with sawdust, and it would look maybe fine. Maybe like I gouged it out and filled it with sawdust. So I'm going to see if I can get the shaper to do the work for me. I have no idea if this is going to work. It could make it look worse. I've cut a couple of test lines here and low raking light so you can kind of see this is on the bottom of the box. So I'm going to flip it over, show you what I'm talking about, and we'll do the dang thing. I gotta admit, I'm as surprised as you are that worked. And before sanding that down flush with the surface, I'm gonna go ahead and let it dry because using PVA glue, the wood fibers can shrink back and cause a divot if you flush surface while the glue is still wet. So just making sure that's good and dry before we come through and flush that. In the meantime, one more repair that I wanted to do, the router on the flush trimming of this trim piece for the interior lip grabbed just a little bit of grain and gave me some tear out. So I'm just coming back through, cleaning out that miter and taking about a 1/4 inch off of the inside. I'll put in an oversized piece to fill the gap. And once dry, we can come back to plane that flat and flush trim the interior edge again. I typically like showing all of my mistakes. We all make them and we all want to know how to fix them. I noticed there was a little bit of the surface that had been marred on the top of the box, so I'm just using baby wipes. Baby wipes are like the best thing to have in the shop because they're great for cleaning up glue and for stuff like this where you just need to steam out a little dent, ding, marring, and just really forcing that water popping action makes the resurfacing and repair of that damaged area quick and easy. And last step, we get to look at that very oddly juxtaposed Macassar ebony bottom, which I still don't know what I was thinking in choosing that for the bottom of this box, but I'm going to inset some rubber stopper feet into the bottom, and we'll get on to the finishing process. One of my favorite finishes to spray and use in general is shellac. I don't get to use it nearly often enough because it is not a very durable finish when it comes to the elements, but for something like a fine box, I think it is the perfect choice. And I have found that spraying really gives the perfect satin to a shellac finish, whereas French polishing with a wad typically results in a much higher sheen. About 5 or 6 coats using the Apollo 6-stage turbine HVLP and a 2-cut of platina shellac, I'm able to easily achieve this sheen and finish quality that I'm looking for by making sure all coats are even and light, and that I'm using 600 grit or equivalent in a Scotch pad between coats, with the dust produced melted back into the surface by wiping with an alcohol-soaked rag between coats to fill the grain. Then is one last light coat and a night to dry, and we're ready to button this thing up. Before affixing the rubber feet, I give the bottom a light buffing while I have access to the whole panel easily with 4/0 steel wool and a little paste wax. Then, first pre-drilling and then screwing, I screw the feet on, and the same buff first approach for the interior before installing the hinges for a final time, and then finally using a little bit of 5-minute epoxy, I can permanently affix the maker medallion emblem on the inside of the lid and the Brusso latches into their final resting places. If you've made it to the end, thanks for sticking around, and I hope you enjoyed this detailed process of how to make a fine little box. If you'd like to check out another approach to this process with maybe a little more hand tools and a couple interesting alternatives to this style of project, be sure to head on over and check out my channel as well, Sawyer, that's Sawyer like Tom, Sawyer Design on YouTube. And before we check out the results, let me just mention a thank you to SawStop for allowing me to take over their feed this week. If you don't already swear by SawStop, I certainly cannot say enough good things about my 5 horsepower ICS and the router table as well. So thanks SawStop, and thank you for tuning in. My name's Nick, and we'll catch you on the next one. Peace.